Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. Today we're nearing almost near the end of the series of the book by Peter Brown, The Love You Make. In the last video, we saw the Beatles deal with the death of their beloved manager, Brian Epstein, and they tried to find inner peace with the Maharishi, but they soon became disillusioned with him. And George was the only one who thought he was okay. Now the marriage between Cynthia and John was starting to come to an end, and it was just as Cynthia had feared. So on the way home from New Delhi, John and Cynthia started to talk about their marriage. They both had been drinking a lot of scotch and cokes, which they hadn't done in a while, and John started to confess that he hadn't been faithful to her throughout the marriage. Cynthia didn't want to hear about it. She said it was worse knowing than not knowing. And John said, "You have to hear it, Cyn," and he put his hand on her arm. He said, "What do you think I've been doing on the road all those years?" And there was a slew of them. And Cynthia said she knew about Hamburg. And John said, in Liverpool, too. Dozens and dozens the whole time they were together. Cynthia started to cry. And John said there was an uncountable number in hotel rooms throughout the world. He said he was afraid she would find out. And that's where the song Norwegian Wood came from. The lyrics were meant not to make sense. He told her about the famous Conquest and others. And when they got to the airport, she was in a panic. The following weekend, John went away to visit Derek Taylor and his wife and kids, and he spent the day tripping on LSD. Derek told John how talented he was, and when John got home, he told Cynthia he wanted to have more children. Cynthia was disheartened by this sudden outburst of affection. She knew it was because of the LSD, and she started crying. And he shouted at her, "What the hell's the matter with you?" And she said, "One LSD trip isn't going to guarantee my future. What's that going to solve?" And then John said, "GDU, pal." Oh, you know that abbreviation. I'm not going to say that. Cynthia said that it wasn't her that he wanted. It was that Japanese woman, Yoko Ono. "Maybe you're right. Maybe she's the woman for you," she said through her tears. And John said that Cynthia was ridiculous. Yoko was crazy and he had no interest in her. All this made the house a tense place to be in. Cynthia was nervous and depressed and on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Cynthia said she felt like she was sitting on the edge of a volcano. John said he had to work long hours on the recording studio for a few weeks. He told her she needed to go away with Jenny and Alex on a vacation to Greece. And Julian went to live with Mrs. Jarlett, and John was alone in the house. John wandered around London, had a few laughs with Terry Doran and Derek. He called up Pete Shotton at the Apple Boutique and asked him if he would like to spend the night at Kenwood with him, so he wouldn't have to watch TV alone. Late at night they sat in the sunroom, the TV on with the sound off, and music was on the stereo, and they talked about their conquest. John then said, "I met this woman called Yoko. She's Japanese." One night he called Yoko up, and John asked if she wanted to come over. So, needless to say, she got on the taxi and was there an hour later. They were shy around each other, and John wasn't sure what to do, so he took her on a tour of the house. They both took LSD, and later John took her up to the studio and played some tapes of electronic music he'd been experimenting with. John tried to play the tapes for the other Beatles and maybe have one of the songs on the album, but Paul didn't want to hear it. And Yoko loved the tapes. She giggled and smiled, and that made John happy. They were both high on acid and spent the night recording together, and when the sun rose, they made love and named the tape The Two Virgins, and they felt reborn. Cynthia returned a few nights later to find them in the kitchen. In this book, it said that Cynthia regretted going to bed with Magic Alex, and it was almost like revenge, and when she awoke the next morning, she was disgusted with herself and wanted to fight for her husband. Cynthia went back to Kenwood to pick up more of her clothes and reconciled, sort of, with John. John said he was bored with Yoko, and Cynthia was invited back if she wanted to. And she was only there a few days when John said he had to go to New York on business, and he was going with Paul to announce the opening of Apple. Cynthia begged to go along, but John said he would be too busy. John said she should go to Italy with her mother and Julian to Pesaro, Italy. Cynthia kissed John goodbye for the last time. In May, when the Beatles met again with George Martin at Abbey Road Studios to record the material they had written in India, Yoko was there, and she was at his side at all times. Everyone thought that Yoko would leave when the album's work was getting going, but John wanted her to stay. This was in defiance to the covenants that Nobody was allowed in the studio while they were working, except for Neil and Mal Evans. And when Dick James showed up, he was politely asked to leave, and Brian was even encouraged to get his business over with and get out. They might not have minded if Yoko had kept at a discreet distance, but she was in the middle of everything. She offered her opinions about their music not once but frequently, and she didn't even know about rock music, so it irritated the Beatles. Paul at first tried to understand Yoko and not make a big deal out of it. The album came first, but Yoko wore him down, and everybody soon began to lose patience with her. To her face they were sarcastic and cold, and behind her back they called her the Jap flavor of the month. They wondered why she went with John to the restroom every time he went. It was assumed that she assisted him in his chore. And then Ringo even went to see John at Weybridge and said, "Listen, John, does Yoko have to be there all the time?" John said, "You just don't understand. It's different with Yoko and me." When comments were made about Yoko, John felt like it was like a knife in the back. He felt like they were threatened by this small woman and closed off to her. He felt like she had given him more alternatives in their few weeks together than the Beatles had in 8 years. She brought back his rebellious nature and brought out the artist in him. She thought there was a hollowness in the pop star life. She was more important to him than they realized. Yoko was his strength, his new lease on life. With Cynthia gone to Italy, John started to take Yoko out in the public eye. The Fleet Street Press was aware of Yoko's presence, but not her importance. The night of his opening at the National Theater, the press wanted to know what was going on. As John and Yoko stepped out of his roles, followed by Neil Aspinall, the flashbulbs went off. A reporter asked, "Where's your wife? Where's Cynthia?" John was stunned. He didn't think he would be challenged in his love for this woman. They kept asking, and John just exploded and said, "I don't know," and made his way to the theater. So I don't know why. He didn't think they would ask any questions. I mean, he'd been with Cynthia for years, and now all of a sudden, Cynthia's nowhere to be seen, and Yoko's by his side. Anybody would be asking. Okay, on June 15th, John and Yoko appeared together at the Coventry Cathedral at an exhibit of recent British sculpture. Yoko got an invitation to participate in the exhibit. Yoko and John came up with the idea of a living sculpture. They would plant 2 acorns and place a brass plaque declaring John by Yoko Ono and Yoko by John Lennon. There they were met for the acorn planting ceremony by Canon Verney. He told them that the cathedral authorities decided they cannot permit them to put the work in the main exhibition area as it was a consecrated ground. The canon didn't think the acorns were real sculpture, and I have to agree with him there. Yoko went into a rage. They reached a compromise and were granted to plant the acorns on a lawn near the cathedral, where the new generation sculptures were being displayed. July the 1st, John made a public declaration of love with an art exhibition he dedicated to Yoko from John with love. John and Yoko arrived dressed all in white, their color-coordinated phase, and Peter Brown wondered what in the blazes was John thinking. The show was an exhibition of collection boxes, charity boxes for the blind, the spastics, the preservation of donkeys for birds and for lepers. A mechanical dog, when fed a sixpence, would bark and wag his tail and lift his leg. The climax of the opening was the release of 365 white helium-filled balloons that were launched in the sky in London. They each carried a tag reading, "You are here. Please write to John Lennon, care of Robert Fraser Gallery." The people who found the balloons and acorns wanted to know what everything was about. The public sentiment was, "Bring back the old Lennon." More than that, they wanted to know where Cynthia and Julian were. John said to a journalist, "I've spoilt my image. People want me to stay in their own bag. They want me to be lovable, but I was never that. Even at school, I was just Lennon. Nobody ever thought of me as cuddly." In Italy, Cynthia saw pictures of John and Yoko in the paper, and she went into a depression. She stayed in her hotel bed, not eating or sleeping. Magic Alex was stirring up trouble. Cynthia's mom, after 2 weeks, got her to go out with Roberto Bassanini. They had gone from club to club drinking until the early morning hours, and when they reached the hotel they were laughing with each other, and Magic Alex was waiting for them. He told Cynthia that John would be interested in knowing what was going on. John said to Alex he wanted a divorce so he could marry Yoko, and if Cynthia didn't cooperate, he would take Julian away from her and ship her back to Liverpool. Cynthia was mad as to be expected and asked, "What grounds is he suing me?" John was claiming adultery, which was a laugh considering what he'd been up to. Alex said he agreed to be correspondent and testify on John's behalf, and Alex pointed out that he had slept with her. Cynthia hurried back to London to talk to John and explain things. It was 2 weeks before she could see him, and they weren't alone. John wanted to have Yoko there with them. Cynthia said that Magic Alex bewitched her with candles and black magic, and she thought he did the same thing to the nurse in India to lie about the Maharishi. John just kept saying he wanted a divorce and there was bound to be bad publicity. Cynthia should keep her mouth shut and let him claim adultery. I guess he would like that. So the meeting ended when John left to go to the bathroom, and Yoko followed him as usual. Cynthia kept her mouth shut and let John sue her. Peter Brown said that everything was proceeding smoothly when in September, John confided that Yoko was pregnant. John said to keep it top secret from the press at the moment, and Peter said it would be rather ludicrous for John to pursue his adultery charges against Cynthia. John dropped the charges, and Cynthia was allowed to turn the tables and sue John for divorce, and it didn't give her any pleasure. She accepted a settlement of £100,000, of which she had to use $25,000 to buy a home for herself and Julian and her mother to live in. Cynthia was cut out of the Beatles and their families. Few of them dared to show her support and speak out against Yoko, or they knew they would face the wrath of John Lennon. Peter said he had tremendous sympathy for Cynthia. He knew, though, the divorce was best for the both of them. Paul was able to show support for Cynthia. He would visit her and Julian, and he wrote "Hey Jude" for Julian. And Cynthia's best friends became strangers. She bought a house in Kensington, and no one heard much from her until she married Roberto Bassanini, July 31st, 1970. They opened a London restaurant, but it wasn't successful. The marriage didn't last long either, and they divorced in 1974. She moved to Ruthin, North Wales. 4 years later, she married restaurateur John Twist, and they opened up a small restaurant and inn in Ruthin. 2 years later, she divorced him. Cynthia believed up till the day that John died that one day they would be back together. I will stop the video here. We saw the marriage between John and Cynthia disintegrate, with John being obsessively close to Yoko, or vice versa, or equally, I'm not sure. He got rid of Cynthia a few times just to be with Yoko, and then became brazen and started to take her out publicly, even though he was still a married man. All he seemed to care about was being with Yoko. Cynthia didn't want to divorce, but John pushed the issue and threatened to take Julian away from her. Then Yoko became pregnant, and it would have been hard for him to charge Cynthia with adultery when he was doing it. Cynthia got money, but she didn't take pleasure in it. She married 2 more times, but never gave up thinking that she and John would be together again one day. She felt that way till the day John died. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated. I hope everybody's been having a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of The Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.